Hello and welcome to the Kubernetes podcast from Google. I'm your host, Caslin Fields.
And I am Abdel Sigiwar.
In this episode, we interview the Kubernetes 1.27 release lead, Xander Grzywinski. We'll explore some of the highlights of the release and discuss a bit about what it's like to work with the release team. But first, let's get to the news.
SIG Security within the Kubernetes community said that the auto-refreshing official CVE feed is in beta now. The programmatically accessible feed allows users to subscribe to the list of CVEs announced by the Kubernetes Security Response Committee. The new version introduced some improvements to the JSON and RSS feeds, in addition to freshness metadata and ordering.
VMware announced the general availability of their Tanzu Mission Control for Amazon Elastic Kubernetes services. The product allows users to create, update, and scale EKS clusters using the native Amazon API directly from Tanzu.
Red Hat announced the general availability of OpenShift virtualization. This add-on is available on OpenShift 4.12 and allows users to manage virtual machines from OpenShift using KubeVirt in a declarative manner.
Azure announced long-term support for Kubernetes on AKS, or Azure Kubernetes Services. Starting with Kubernetes 1.27, Microsoft will offer 2 years' worth of support and security updates for AKS clusters, instead of the usual 1 year offered by the project.
Google Cloud turned profit for the first time in its history. On the earnings call for the first quarter of 2023, Google turned around $190 million of profit for cloud services. The total revenue increase for this quarter was 28% higher than the same quarter of last year.
The CNCF announced a new CFP platform for upcoming events. The migration from SMAPLY, or SMApply, to Sessionize was motivated by the record number of submissions received for KubeCon EU 2023, which was about 1.7 thousand, in addition to the 16 community days organized in 2022. The new platform, according to the CNCF, should enable them to better handle the proposals for future events.
The CNCF, in partnership with ChainGuard, performed a software supply chain security assessment for 2 graduated projects, Argo and Prometheus. The assessment was based on the supply chain levels of Software Architect, or SALSA, version 0.1. They concluded that Argo meets SALSA level 3 for audibility of source and integrity of the provenance, while Prometheus only meets level 3 for the same framework for source and build, but level 0 for provenance. Reports for both projects can be found in the show notes.
The next edition of KubeCon EU will take place in Paris from March 19th to 22nd in 2024. The CNCF also announced that KubeCon is returning to APAC for the first year since the pandemic on September 25th to 27th in 2023 in Shanghai, China. The CFP for both KubeCon NA and KubeCon Shanghai are open, with both closing June 18th.
Traffic Labs adds API Hub for Kubernetes. The new API Hub makes it simpler to publish, secure, and manage APIs on Kubernetes. This SaaS offering is available in closed beta, but the company aims to make a GA on May 16.
The CNCF announced the spring 2023 cohort of the CNCF Ambassadors Program. The revamped edition of the program saw 155 ambassadors accepted, representing 37 countries and 125 companies. And that's the news. I'm Caslin Fields with the Kubernetes podcast from Google, and I am live on site with Xander Grzywinski. Xander, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Xander. I was the 1.27 release lead and have been involved in the project and SIG release for a while now. And outside of that, I am a senior open source PM with Microsoft.
So you do quite a few things. Though today we're mainly going to be focusing on the 1.27 release, which has the theme of chill vibes. I'm definitely a fan of this. I like that someone pointed out this week while we've been at KubeCon that it's titled Chill Vibes, and I think a lot of folks are feeling that here in Amsterdam this week in April.
Yeah, it's a fun theme. I think I started thinking about it after we did the enhancements freeze, which for those of you that don't know is a milestone that we have in the release process. It occurs like 3 to 4 weeks into the release, in which we kind of lock down the features that are going to be in the release. And generally, as part of that, there are a number of features that typically fall behind on the criteria needed for that lock-in, and then there's an exception process. I've been on the team for over 3 years now, and I've spoken to folks on there longer. This is the first release anyone can remember where we didn't get a single exception request. Like, every single feature that put themselves up for the release met all the criteria, and things just kind of like flowed really smoothly from there.
Impressive.
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect that to work out.
Yeah.
I think a lot of folks listening are probably familiar with similar processes of having to cut a release, essentially.
Yeah, and we actually had like more features in this release than is typical as well. So like to not only see the increase in number, but then not have a single exception request come through, like it was pretty spectacular.
And also, speaking from an open source perspective, my work in contributor experience, it's always a tough time to get a hold of the heads of the SIGs and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's
People are
not
always
like they
busy.
have things going on or anything.
Yeah.
Like, no, they're so busy. They're doing so much. And I always kind of feel like a dweeb, like, hey, can you update your cap? And we just need this little PR for documentation, because they're doing so much. And like, it's truly astounding work.
Yeah. So what are some of the new features that are in this release?
There's really a lot. And I think I saw this on Twitter. It's saw someone refer to it as like the first big boring release. It's like it's full of features, but also it's like it's all stuff that just is kind of like making things more stable and building on the existing functionality. And I think that's just kind of where we are in the Kubernetes project right now. But there's a couple that I think the vertical in-place pod auto-scaling entering alpha, which has been talked about for a long time, but finally reached the alpha state with this release, is the one that I think I'm personally most excited about. I think that's going to be cool for a lot of people. And then there's some cool storage stuff too. Like, that's an area I know that's had a lot of spirited debate in the past on whether you should put state on Kubernetes, but I think SIG storage is just full of so many brilliant engineers that are doing amazing things to take those storage primitives like further and further and make them more stable, and we're seeing some of that with this release too.
I'm really excited about those areas as well.
Yeah.
I've explored the vertical pod autoscaler a little bit on my own, and it's definitely been a bit confusing.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see what this new release holds for that. And also, I was just giving a talk about stateful, and I'm trying to get more into that space. So I'm curious to hear about that more as well.
There's some cool stuff there, and like I said, that SIG is just brilliant. Like, it's a good exercise to just go and read some of their keps and get a good idea of like what they're working on. It's all really cool.
So that's a couple of the new things. Are there any deprecations or removals in 1.27?
Yeah, there's a whole list of stuff that kind of meets that criteria, and we started publishing a deprecations and removals blog ahead of the typical release blog, which is a good thing to go check out. We're trying to just communicate that stuff earlier. And then the one that everyone has absolutely heard about and is almost certainly sick of hearing about, and yet I'm going to keep talking about it, is the registry change.
We've all got to keep harping on that one.
Yeah, the kates.gcr.io cut over to registry.kates.io. So that's the one that we really tried to over-communicate throughout the release to ensure that users are not impacted by that change in a negative way.
Yeah, and it has a lot of opportunity to also help users. It provides performance enhancements, theoretically, should be for a lot of users.
Yeah. In the past, images were being pulled from a central repository, and now we've got a more geo-distributed setup, and it's also a chance to kind of distribute the cost of running the infrastructure for the project across multiple cloud providers, and it really is like a way for the community to come together and like support the project as a whole.
Yeah, if you haven't checked out any of the information about that change or how it was achieved, definitely very interesting stuff. But coming back to deprecations and removals, are there any specific ones that you want to call out?
Beyond the registry change, no, I don't actually know off the top of my head which ones are on there. I think, I don't remember where pod security policies are in the pipeline at the moment.
Right,
but
they're
that's
kind
the
of
big
awkward.
one that like I know would bite people if they don't keep an eye on like migrating over to pod security admission. And yeah.
Yes, so if you've been keeping an eye on that space, or if you haven't, pod security policies were deprecated couple of releases ago?
Yeah, I want to say like 4 releases ago, somewhere in there.
Like
I've been on the team since like 2019, so it really does all kind of blend together at this point.
Yeah, and to clarify the terminology, I didn't explain that earlier, but deprecated means that it's going to be removed at some time in the future. Removed means that it's not there anymore for you to use.
Right.
So pod security policies are still in a deprecated state, I think. Although I have to check.
Yeah, I guess I would have to check too. I know if they're not yet removed, it would be soon. Yeah.
We'll have to include a link to that blog post in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yes. And then they're being replaced by the new pod security admission.
Pod security admission, yeah, is the new thing to replace. And then there's also, I think a lot of folks end up moving to things like Open Policy Agent Gatekeeper and Kyverno, those like dedicated policy tools too, some people tend to rely on.
Yeah, policy is a very interesting area that folks are working on right now. I feel like we're talking about a lot of interesting areas. We're talking about autoscaling. And actually, when we were talking about the vertical pod autoscaler, we didn't explain that much about what it does, did we?
I don't think so.
So maybe we should do that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, you when you deploy a pod, you set the like resource requirements of the pod. And this is a feature that's going to allow you to auto scale that without actually having to like completely remove the pod and like edit it and redeploy. So in the same way that you have the typical like scale out horizontally through replicas, now you will be able to have auto scaling for the resources of a single pod.
And that's something I'm always harping on. Set your resource requests and limits.
Yeah. It is a little confusing how those actually work under the hood, but it is worth like taking the time to dig into that documentation and like really get that right.
So you can run things on Kubernetes without even caring or knowing that resource requests and limits exist at all. But if you do know that they exist and you start using them, then you have much better control over the actual resource usage of your clusters.
Yeah, and just running things, it works great until you start to pack your nodes pretty full, and then things can really start to fall apart.
And the whole point of Kubernetes is managing workloads at scale.
Right.
So it's really important to manage those resources at the kind of scale that Kubernetes often reaches. Mm-hmm. So there was also a KEP, I hear, that was rather interesting in the 1.27 release, KEP 753, and it has something to do with sidecar containers. I'm honestly not familiar. Would you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I know about that one. So one of the consequences of being the like all-up release lead is that, we had 60 KEPs that made it to the actual release in this one. So, like, my familiarity for all of them is only, like, surface level. I'm more herding cats throughout the process, really. But this one, defining, like, sidecars as a specific type of container that the kubelet would handle in a different way and, like, prioritize in a different way. Sidecars, I think, have always been kind of like a contentious, like there are a lot of people that don't like the pattern in the ways that it's used. But I know that there are a lot of folks that are excited for this one, and, maybe going forward, if you can get the kubelet to treat sidecar containers in a specific way, that might actually help support the pattern a little bit better and make it a little more flexible.
Yeah, sidecar containers are definitely a very popular pattern that I see. I often give intro to Kubernetes talks, and one of the things I talk about in those is just explaining what a pod is. And so I always explain that you can have multiple containers in one pod, but the most common way that folks do that is with a sidecar container. So it is very common. I'm curious to see how this would impact things, especially because Kubernetes doesn't usually care about things at the container level too much.
Right.
We usually keep things at the pod level, so I can see why that might be a little contentious.
Yeah, and you do see things like some service mesh tools like moving away from the sidecar pattern and such, but like it's certainly not going anywhere. Like It's always going to be a requirement to some degree.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of benefits that sidecar containers can get you. So I'll be curious to check that one out, and we'll include a link to that Kubernetes enhancement proposal, KEP, in the show notes if you want to read more of the details and the discussion that's going on around that. So what is the relation between that KEP and the release? Is there something going on with it in the release, or just a discussion that's been very prominent lately?
So that one, I know it had a graduation, this release. And I
what does a graduation for a KEP mean?
So when a feature is introduced to Kubernetes, it is introduced at the alpha stage for the API. And then at some point after some number of release cycles, sometimes one, sometimes more, it will graduate from alpha to beta and then from beta to stable. Currently, there are 3 stages for those APIs. And so the sidecar KEP had a graduation this release. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it was to beta. but I'd have to double check. But the significance there is that with alpha features and APIs, those have to be enabled by a feature flag when running Kubernetes, and then beta features are on by default. So you don't have to utilize them, but they are on. And so that ends up being kind of a significant milestone, because then for all of the managed Kubernetes services through cloud providers, you then have access to the beta APIs.
Okay. All right. I guess folks will start learning a lot more about that one potentially then in the 1.27 release. So as the release lead, what were you most excited about in this release?
Yeah, I think the vertical pod autoscaling, which we mentioned, was one big point of excitement for me. Two, just the theme in general. It made my job a lot easier, really, to not have to worry about all the exception requests and such. And then I think working with the team was just really wonderful. We have a awesome group of people that volunteer to help out with the release. And so just getting the chance to work with a global community of amazing people is just a really cool opportunity. And that, as long as I've been involved with the release, continues to be one of the best things about being a part of it.
And we're already past the point that the release came out. 1.27 came out on April
11th. So it was last Tuesday, yeah.
From when we're recording. Yeah. So we're already past that point, which means that the next release cycle is already starting up. So it might be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about the release team and how that's structured. And I know shadow applications for 1.28, I believe, are already open.
They are, yeah. So we have a structured shadow program as a way to onboard new contributors to the project. So applications for that are open. It's a really great way to get involved in the project and the community. And I don't know what's special about it to me is people of all backgrounds and skill sets can really bring somebody to that team. So on the release team, we're not really writing code. It's more process oriented. And so it provides a great opportunity for folks that maybe were put off from open source thinking that it was exclusively code contribution to really be able to step in and add valuable contributions. If you are someone that is more oriented towards getting deep into the code, the release engineering team as part of SIG release is always looking for help too. And I mention it because the shadow program at this point has grown so much that it receives hundreds upon hundreds of applications every time we open it. And it's really hard to choose people because we just get so many awesome applicants. And so if you are, code-oriented, I'd love to steer folks towards the release engineering team as well, because they always need help, and it's a great group of folks to work with, too.
Yeah, if you are going to try to apply to the shadow program, it's probably pretty helpful to have a rough understanding of what the roles are that you could be shadowing for.
Yeah. So we have the enhancements team, which they are the ones that are kind of tracking all of the features that are going into the release and making sure that everything is in place in terms of just documentation and organization for the release process. And then there is the CI signal team, which is watching all of the dashboards throughout the release to make sure that we're seeing mostly green colors and things are working as expected. And they're the ones that kind of give the go and no-go on each release throughout the process. There's also docs and release notes, which are two teams, but they work quite closely together to make sure that the website documentation is ready to go for all of the new features, as well as just the actual release notes themselves. And then communications, which, what we're doing right now, the communications team ends up making sure that all of the blogs are in place and then organizing interviews like this to kind of communicate some of the new features. And then last but certainly not least would be the bug triage team. And so they are tracking any items that may prevent the release from getting out the door on time, things that would be release blocking bugs, getting those things cleaned up and taken care of even past code freeze.
So the bug tracking team must work with the other SIGs quite a bit.
Yes. They are working very closely with all of the SIG leads.
Excellent. And an interesting thing about the release team is you see a lot of folks in release who are not super deep Kubernetes contributors. It's a great way for folks, even who are not deep into the community, to get involved. So
I myself have never opened a PR against Kubernetes, but I've been doing the release team for over 3 years now. And it just goes to show that like folks of all different backgrounds and skill sets can bring valuable contributions to the project.
It's amazing how we can distribute that work. It's so valuable to be able to have so many different people working on such important parts of the project.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, there are, I would say, almost no people that have a full understanding of the entire project. Like, it is very distributed and by necessity at this point.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about the release team. We've talked a little bit about 1.27. For our listeners out there who maybe have to administrate Kubernetes clusters for their own work or for their home, whatever they may use Kubernetes for, why should they upgrade to 1.27?
I know upgrading is a tough point for cluster operators, especially with Kubernetes releasing, 3 times a year now. It can be tough to keep up on that. I think the more that you stay up to date on that, the easier the upgrades are. And so I think it's worth putting in the time up front to try and stay up to date. But it gets particularly important when you get past that 1 year support window where patch releases are no longer included. So folks that are on like 1.23 especially and before would really want to consider upgrading so that they maintain those patch releases.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with me today, Xander.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for the interview. That was actually pretty cool.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun talking with Xander at KubeCon.
Yeah, and I know actually that it was kind of hard to schedule the time because it was going to happen, then it was not going to happen, but at the end you managed to get your hands on Xander at KubeCon.
Yeah, we ended up finding some time, and it's also kind of hard to find a good space for recording an interview at KubeCon because, of course, we're all very busy while we're at KubeCon doing talks and connecting with people that we work with in the open source community and things like that. So it took until the last day of the conference, but we managed to work it out.
Yeah. By the way, I learned something at KubeCon because we are using the same set of microphones to do the recording when we do event recording, right? It's like the wireless Rode microphone. I figured that there is actually a way where you can turn it into a handheld microphone. So you can buy like an attachment.
Yeah, I really want to buy that.
Yeah, I want to buy that as well because it makes you look like a real journalist.
Yeah.
All right, so there was actually a bunch of things at the interview with Xander that I want to dive into. And I think, like, starting with the theme, Chilled Vibes. That's a pretty interesting name.
Chilled Vibes. It is pretty great. A lot of folks I talked to on site thought it was particularly relevant with KubeCon being during the week that it was in Amsterdam.
I mean, I have to admit that this probably was one of my favorite KubeCons since I've been going to KubeCon. The venue was great. I love Amsterdam. So it was pretty nice.
Yeah. And so I talked with Xander about that, and he didn't really give much insight into where the name came from.
Okay. The logo is pretty cool. It's like a little bear hugging bear, I think, or panda or whatever.
His story for it was just like, I felt like what I got out of his explanation of it was that was his wish for the release, was to focus on the chill vibes rather than the stressful parts of the release.
Okay.
So I feel like that was his wish for the release.
It is the release lead that chooses the name, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, choose the theme, basically. And
yeah, they have so much fun with it.
Yeah.
It's always great to ask them about it.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to have the sticker of the logo on my laptop.
Yeah.
Because now we have the 126, which is Electrify. We got that from Leonard.
Yeah.
So I think we have to keep this as a habit. Each time we get a release lead, we have to get them to get a sticker. That's how it works.
Yeah.
That's the deal.
I'm going to need a special book or something to keep those in.
Or I'm going to need a bigger laptop. My laptop is getting full of stickers. There was a bunch of other interesting things that came out in this. I mean, it doesn't feel to me like it was very chilled. There is a lot of changes. There have been a lot of changes actually in 1.27, right?
It's an interesting name for a release. I think that it had one of the highest numbers of changes of any release, actually.
Yeah, 60 enhancements or something?
Yeah,
which
it was
crazy,
a lot.
yeah. And so one of the ones that I wanted to dive into a little bit, because I have a little bit of context, is KAP, which stands for Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal 753 for sidecar containers.
Right. We talked about that a little bit with Xander, but he wasn't super familiar. I think you have more context to add, right, Abdel?
Yeah, pretty much. So essentially what that improvement proposal was about is to make the kubelet handle sidecars different than they handle regular containers. And I can give a few examples, but the main one, for example, is service mesh. Xander talked about service mesh very briefly.
He did.
It is described in the enhancement proposal, but here is the use case. So when you use a service mesh which uses sidecars, like Istio, for example, if your container is starting with a sidecar before the sidecar, which is the proxy, is available. So before the sidecar is fully ready, your application cannot make any network calls. So basically your application is stuck until the sidecar is available. Which means if, for example, as part of your bootstrap process for your application, you are talking to like an external API or you're doing some sort of authentication, you can't make those network calls, right? And so that proposal have been to say, if the kubelet can handle the sidecar different than the container, then it could potentially, for example, define or start the containers in a specific order. So start the sidecar first, wait until it's available, and then start the actual application container.
So it's all about the ordering of how the containers come up, which makes a lot of sense for the kubelet to have some hand in.
Exactly.
And it also sounds like it might have some relationship to like health checks, because you want to make sure that your health checks are passing by making sure that those are up in the right order and they can actually communicate.
That's also another one, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because health checks, a big part of it is making sure that the application is ready to communicate.
Correct. Yeah.
So
it's basically making sure that the sidecar does not break network calls for the application itself. And it's not only for service mesh, by the way. It works for, sometimes you have a use case where your sidecar is just like a log aggregator or like a log router. So your sidecar is just collecting the logs from the container of the app and then sending them somewhere.
Yeah.
So in all these cases, that's essentially what you want to do. You want to be able to say, my sidecar starts first, gets to a ready stage, whatever ready stage means for that specific sidecar, and then you can start the application itself, the container of the application.
Okay, cool. So that sounds like a pretty useful update, which there's more information on in the blog, right?
Yes.
And of course, we'll have more information in our show notes.
All right, so that's pretty cool. I think the other one, obviously, is like the k8s.gcr.io freeze, which continues to be a thing. We have talked about it many times.
It's going to be a thing for until something else is in place and everything goes haywire. But hopefully folks out there are listening to the news. Please change all of your references.
Yeah. So one more thing I wanted to get your opinion about, which came up actually in the news that we recorded for this episode. It's the Microsoft announcing LTS support for Kubernetes, where they will be announcing or supporting, I think, old versions or certain versions for 2 years instead of the standard 1 year that the community offers.
Right. That was a big thing for the contributor community to be talking about at KubeCon this year. At the Contributor Summit, there was a kind of an unconference session. We have an unconference at the Contributor Summit where folks can submit their own topics. So that was one of the ones that was talked about there, since it was a very new thing and folks are still kind of trying to process it. Definitely folks had very strong opinions. The community is paying attention and looking at what this might mean for users and also for the open source project and things like that. Personally, my favorite take that I've heard about it is one from one of our colleagues, Nick Eberts. I was talking with him about it, and he made a really good point that upgrades are just so painful.
Yes.
The point of a long-term support would be, we've got all of these releases coming out all the time. It's way too much for anyone to realistically keep up with.
Yes.
I think we can all admit. And also what I see realistically in the field is that folks don't upgrade their clusters in place. They create a new cluster and they move everything. And when I was talking with Nick, he was saying that he thinks that should be the regular best practice kind of pattern, because everything running in your cluster should be configured such that it's not dependent on the cluster that it's running on. Kubernetes is the platform, but all of the stuff running on top of it, you should be able to move it to another Kubernetes cluster without much hassle, theoretically.
Yeah.
So he thinks that the process for upgrades should be that you create a whole new cluster and you transition things over to the new cluster instead of upgrading in place, which I think makes a lot of sense. Rather than long-term support, which he argued kind of puts a Band-Aid on the problem of, we're going to support you a little bit longer, which just gets you more out of date.
Exactly.
And that's one thing the community was talking about. If you are on these long-term support channels, then you're on this one version for longer. What is then your upgrade path? What is that going to look like for you? So that's something folks are still figuring out.
And whether, for example, you will be able to skip version, like
upgrades.
go from 127 to 129 directly, or do you have to go to the 128?
Yeah, that was one of the major conversations happening at the Contributor Summit.
Yeah, I remember we had a brief conversation about it. We were heading out for dinner at KubeCon, and we talked about it with Nick. I took some time a little bit to reflect on it. And I think, first of all, I'm not surprised, right? Microsoft have a long history in supporting software. They know how to do it. So announcing LTS is not really something new for them, I guess. The way they would describe it in the blog is we're going to clone or fork actually the version. So that they're just going to keep an internal version of the code base. So it's going to be interesting. I think, personally, the right way to do this is to have people focus on making upgrades a non-event.
Yeah.
Because the core of the problem is that upgrades is an issue for people because it's disruptive and it could potentially make your workload go down and stuff like that. And if I put just briefly my ex-consultant's hat on, I would say, well, just focus on making upgrades a non-issue for you as a customer, as people using the platform, which is hard to implement because, not everybody is skilled and have time and have engineering resources and stuff. And so that's why I think cloud providers and the community should actually think about how can we make upgrades a non-problem. Either, as you say, making the application... I still disagree on the fact that the application should not be dependent. It is because API version changes all the time. And that's one of the major problems with upgrades, right? Is if an API goes from alpha to beta or from beta to GA, you should be able to catch that and update your deployments, right? So I don't know how this could be implemented. We do it on GKE when you're about to upgrade your clusters. We have a little interface that tells you, hey, these APIs are going to be deprecated or they're moving from one stage to another, right?
Yeah, it's nice to find that out through checks rather than through, I tested it and now it doesn't work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I see where Nick's opinion and your opinion about trying new cluster comes from, because essentially you're going to be able to catch issues before they become an issue by trying to deploy your application on a new version. And then if it doesn't work, you can go check documentation and update your application accordingly. Yeah, I think it's a very hard problem to solve. I think making upgrades not an issue is probably the right direction. What that means, how it's going to manifest itself is TBD, I guess.
Yeah, that's probably too big of a problem for anyone to tackle head on. Everyone's tackling it from different aspects of the upgrade process. And maybe eventually it'll be better than it is today, but we just got to kind of work with it in the meantime.
Exactly. We'll see.
So one other thing that I wanted to go over was the conversation that I had with Xander about vertical pod autoscaler. So the vertical pod autoscaler is something that I've taught some workshops on and stuff, because understanding all of the different ways that things can autoscale in Kubernetes is very important since it is all about running things at scale. But the VPA is very interesting because it is open source, but it comes from a lot of the stuff that Google has done for our own managed Kubernetes service for GKE. So it came out of those efforts. And so for quite a while, it's been something that's in open source, but none of the other providers have really supported it.
Yeah.
And it also has had some challenges, one of which is getting addressed in the 1.27 release. It's not in the release blog.
Yeah, we find out.
Yeah.
We find out the hard way.
So it's something that Xander talked about a lot as being something that's really interesting. Hopefully other folks are actually using the VPA now because Xander is at Microsoft. So anyway, the vertical pod autoscaler, traditionally it's been kind of difficult to use the vertical pod autoscaler as an autoscaler.
Yes, in auto mode.
Yeah. The recommendation has been to use it in manual mode, which basically it then gives you recommendations of here's how you should be setting your resource requests and limits. It also has the ability to set those resource requests and limits for you, but that's been disruptive. And what's changing in 1.27 is that is now not so disruptive, right?
Yeah. So it's supporting this thing called in-place upgrade or updates, where basically it modifies the resources without restarting your pod. Because you do not want to turn VPA on a pod which runs a database, obviously, right? Because then if it's auto mode, it will just restart your database.
Yes. So if you have the opportunity to use the vertical pod autoscaler, I like it because it puts some of the challenge of setting those resource requests and limits on something else, on tooling that's going to monitor your workloads and tell you what you need to do. It can do that in manual mode, as has been the recommendation in the past, or now with this in-place pod resource request and limit setting. It should be less disruptive. It won't be turning your pods off all the time to change their resource requests and limits and restarting them. So it might be something to look into if you haven't in the past, or if you have in the past and you didn't want to use it because of that disruption. The new changes in 1.27 might make the vertical pod autoscaler more interesting to you.
Yeah. And if you are on GKE, we have actually used the vertical pod autoscaler. We turn them on automatically now, and we collect the recommendations. We turn them on in recommendation mode, and we collect the recommendation and we make it available in the interface.
Yeah.
So if you go to the GKE interface, you can go to like I don't remember what's the name of the tab, gives you recommendations.
It's like the Insights tab or something like that.
Yes, exactly. So if you're on GK, you don't have to do anything special. It already works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. Thank you very much for the interview, Kathleen.
Yeah. Excited to get to talk about 1.27, and I hope folks will check out all the new changes.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of another episode. If you enjoyed this show, please help us spread the word and tell a friend. If you have any feedback for us, you can find us on Twitter at KubernetesPod, or reach out to us by email at kubernetespodcast@google.com. You can also check out the website at kubernetespodcast.com, where you'll find transcripts, show notes, and links to subscribe. Please consider rating us in your podcast player so we can help more people find and enjoy the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.